So, chapter 23, we're going to start on plate 125, talking about the adrenal. Adrenal gland sits above the kidneys, adrenal. Now, again, that's a human anatomical term. They sit anterior or farther forward, more cranial in animals, much smaller tissue, usually embedded in adipose tissue. It is composed of two major cell types. One is modified neural tissue, that is the adrenal medulla, and then modified epithelial tissue, the cortex, the adrenal cortex. And we're going to start right with the adrenal medulla. We've already talked about it. We're coming back to re-emphasize the importance of this gland. You recall that the adrenal medulla is composed of modified post-ganglionic sympathetic neural cells, right? So cells, post-ganglionic, of the sympathetic nervous system, modified in the sense that the sympathetic neurotransmitter is primarily norepinephrine. The primary hormone released from the adrenal medulla is epinephrine, and that's emphasized right here. And you don't have to remember, this 80-20 proportion is actually a species, a function of the different species, but the adrenal medulla tends to produce more epinephrine. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are both examples of catecholamines. And this diagram is meant to show you the interaction and synergy of the sympathetic nervous system. So there's the preganglionic cell, the postganglionic cell, the release of norepinephrine, and the preganglionic cell coming to the adrenal medulla, and then these modified cells that are dumping catecholamines into the blood. Nervous system, very fast response, hormonal, slower, but longer acting. So the adrenal medulla is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Cell types that secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine are very colorful. When you look at them in the histology slides, they actually have color to them. They're called chromaffin cells, and they secrete the norepi and epi, and that gets dropped into the blood. The stimulus for the release of this, sympathetic nervous system. What are the kind of things that are going to drive stress, flight or fright when you need to activate the sympathetic nervous system? So look at the flight, fright, or exercise functions down below. Norepinephrine. Don't need blood necessarily to the kidneys, the digestive tract, spleen. Those are unimportant organs. If you can't get those organs away from the cave bear, he's going to be eating them. So you need to get away. Vasoconstrict that. Decrease digestive activity. Increase breakdown of glycogen. So hormones that are going to elevate blood glucose. Glucagon, norepinephrine. It breaks down glycogen. It makes that glucose available. Increased fat metabolism. Break the triglycerides down into fatty acids. Send those substrates to the metabolizing muscle. Increase heart rate. Brain arousal. In fact, your nervous tissue does. So we talk about eustress, or having some appropriate stress. In order to be alert, a little sympathetic activity is not bad. Hair erection. Oh, I got so scared the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Dog, right? Stress situation. Looks a little bigger, doesn't it? That fur rises. There is an increase in blood pressure. Now, we talked about changes. Well, if we didn't, we should have changes of blood pressure. We talked about regulation of blood pressure. That in fact, during exercise, blood pressure doesn't increase that much. Well, that's because you produce local increases in blood flow to the muscle. So let's say you get stressed, but you don't exercise. Hypertension. So we talk about being hypertensive and being really stressed. So the best thing you can do is go out and exercise. That will mediate or negate that effect. Epinephrine, hormone, longer acting, slower to respond, but increased heart activity. That's why you can still have this kind of adrenaline rush, this feeling of just really being pumped way after that. So the cave bear has gone on. You were able to get your spleen away from the cave bear to need it, but there's still this, your heart is pounding, increased heart activity. Vasodilation to the muscle. So in addition to local metabolite control in that muscle, you are funneling blood to that muscle. Bronchial dilation. Increase the airways. Epinephrine, like norepinephrine, increases lipid breakdown, glycogen breakdown. The brain arousal. Talked about the sympathetic nervous system, pupil dilation. You can get it both from norepi and epi. Increase in basal metabolic rate. So it's like you're gearing the whole system up. So adrenal medulla. What about the adrenal cortex? That's plate 126. Not neural tissue. Epithelial tissue. The adrenal cortex, it's the cortex or outer portion of the term cortex refers to bark. So you can think of this kind of the bark or the covering of the adrenal gland. Is divided up into three zones, zones that you're going to see in lab histologically: the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. Now, while these descriptions can be made in a general sense, sometimes identifying them histologically can be a challenge. But in fact, if you go in and you stain for different hormones, you will find that each of these zones is responsible for the production of different types of hormones. These hormones are steroid hormones. So every other hormone we've talked up to this point has been protein, amino acid, or peptide derivative. They have all acted through extracellular receptors with the exception of T3, T4, the thyroid hormones. Now we have a group of hormones, steroids, which act by intracellular receptors. So the identification of a target cell requires receptors inside the cell. Glomerulosa, mineral corticoid. So we've put that suffix of corticoid to let you know it's a steroid. And it is important in the regulation of minerals. And the primary mineral corticoid that we talk about is aldosterone. The next layer, the fasciculata, has a glucocorticoid. And we're going to spend some time talking about glucocorticoids, particularly because its importance in disease processes. And the third zone, the one that's right next to the medulla, is the reticularis, and it has to do with steroid hormones involved in sex. Male hormones called androgens and female hormones estrogens. So let's look first all at actions of aldosterone. This is a review. We've kind of gone through this again. Remember the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidney responding to decreases in blood pressure and also responding to decreased levels of sodium. So you're bleeding out or you haven't been eating adequate amounts of sodium in your diet. That produces a hormone called renin. Renin acts on a protein called angiotensinogen, produced by the liver, to form an active compound called angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted by a enzyme from the lungs, a angiotensin converting enzyme, the enzyme converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. It is this compound that has the most vasoactive properties. It's a very potent vasoconstrictor. In addition, it is this compound which stimulates the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone from the adrenal cortex goes to the kidney, where it increases sodium reabsorption. If you increase sodium reabsorption, you increase water reabsorption. Increases sodium, decreases potassium. So let's then turn to plate 127 and look at actions of another one of the adrenal cortical hormones, the glucocorticoids. Stimulus for glucocorticoid release is stress. All been there. All know about it. In fact, we use the primary glucocorticoids in humans, dogs, horses, cortisol, cats. So most of our domestic animals have a propensity for cortisol secretion. That is a stress hormone. To date, probably our best indicator of overall stress in an animal is by measuring cortisol levels. Now, albeit it's a little coarse, doesn't allow you to dissect it very easily. But so a generalized stress response, whether hit by car, cat gets hit by a car, exercise, being chased by a cave bear, it's stressful, pain. So things that perturb the system create a release of cortisol. How do you sense that? How do you get stressed out? Well, you have a brain and you have a hypothalamus. So there's the hypothalamus. It produces the release of corticotropic releasing hormone, acts on the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. ACTH has as its target tissue then the adrenal cortex, specifically this layer that's producing the glucocorticoids. In response, cortisol is released. So here again, this hypothalamus, release of CRH, ACTH. Remember that the stress response also involves the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system involves not only norepinephrine and neurotransmitters, but also the release of catecholamines from the adrenal medulla. So in a generalized stress response, so another way of assessing an animal's stress is by measuring catecholamine concentrations. More rapid, slower. The role of cortisol is to mobilize substrates, fat and protein catabolism. So we talk about a catabolic process. That's a breakdown. You are breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids. You're breaking down proteins. You also break down glycogen. Glycogen produces glucose. So another hyperglycemic hormone. So what I'd like you to do is kind of make a list of all of the hormones that elevate blood glucose. And look at the number of hormones that are really focused on keeping glucose levels high. The importance of being able to provide that glucose to your brain, to your heart, to metabolizing muscles to get you away from the cave bear. So there's an overall metabolic response. We also have crossover in immunological response because cortisol isn't effective at modulating, at decreasing the immune response. So our white cells, the production, our lymph nodes, production of lymphocytes and hormone production is also requires cortisol. We can use this to our advantages in modulating the effects of inflammation. A consequence of tissue damage, wounds and injuries is an inflammatory response. Allergies and rheumatism. Rheumatism is an autoimmune immunological disease. Allergies, excessive immunological response. If we want to decrease these, if we want to suppress these, cortisol works very well in having an anti-inflammatory effect. So in addition to metabolic effects, we have anti-inflammatory effects. So cortisol is very important in that. What happens with prolonged stress, prolonged secretion of cortisol? Immunological suppression leading to lymphatic atrophy. So can you take me out of the picture for a minute, Bo? No, yeah, I think. So lymphatic atrophy, ulcers, hypertension. So let's look at this disease in more detail, and we can do that on plate 128. Adrenal, this is, sorry. Here's my Cushing's disease. 128. Before we get to that, let's mention the third group of steroid hormones in the adrenal cortex, and those are the sex steroids. You can put me back. There we go. Sex steroids, androgens. An androgenic compound is one that produces male-like characteristics. Estrogens produce female characteristics, as does the progesterone. So we see that the zona reticularis is producing small concentrations of these. The primary ones are androgens. Androgens tend to have their effect on male reproductive organs, like the testes, female on ovaries. Where we see this playing out is in adrenal disorders. Excessive action of sex steroids, because they're primarily androgens, will tend to have androgenic effects. So those physical traits and tissue responses of to androgens will be manifested. So individuals who have excessive secretion of androgen, changes in their hairline, receding hairline, more facial hair, decrease in mammary tissue, increase in body hair, increase in muscular design, and also changes in the voice. Now this can happen in males, and when it happens in young males, it's referred to as an infant Hercules. You don't have to know that for this class. But imagine that these individuals are more precocious. They've got more testosterone, more androgenic compounds, so they tend to develop hair much earlier, develop larger muscles. In females, we tend to recognize more with old age. And that has to do with the fact that the adrenals are still producing some of the androgens, but normal production of estrogen and progesterones drop. Consequently, there is a masculinity that tends to occur. What about a disorder associated with cortisol secretion? One of the primary diseases with the adrenal cortex and glucocorticoids is actually a hypersecretion of cortisol, named after a British physician called Cushing's. So we talk about a Cushing's syndrome. That is a hypoglucocorticoid individual. So consider those things that you would see with excessive amounts of cortisol. Important in the stress response, breakdown of protein, breakdown of fats, sugars. We see this in dogs. Cushingoid dog presents. There is a breakdown in lipids and a redistribution. In humans, it tends to be a distribution that goes to the face and to the back in the interscapular region. In your book, it talks about this buffalo hump, buffalo torso. This is a change in the lipid deposits. In dogs, it tends to be abdominal. So these dogs will present with this really protruding abdomen, all of lipid. They're still undergoing protein catabolism, so they're getting skinnier and skinnier. Their muscles are atrophied. Interestingly, in dogs, it's also characterized by hair loss. So that's protein lipid. What about glucose? It is a hyperglycemic compound, hormone. So these individuals are hyperglycemic. Consequences to that? Elevated blood glucose, some of the same clinical symptoms that you would see in diabetes mellitus. Too much glucose, so they're peeing it out in the urine. That's a glucosuria. Their water goes with it, so these animals are polyuric, PU. They drink a lot, polydipsic. So they look very similar to diabetes mellitus. What's the difference going to be? So we've got diabetes mellitus and Cushing's. Elevated cortisol, diabetes mellitus, insulin deficiency. Insulin deficiency leads to increases in blood glucose. That leads to PUPD, glucosuria. Cushing's, increased cortisol. That's going to lead to increased glucose, PUPD. Big difference is going to be in concentrations of cortisol. Diabetes mellitus, normal or low cortisol. Cushing's, elevated cortisol. So if you have this animal presented, one of the first things you want to do, run a blood panel, look for cortisol. All right, so Cushing, most common form of Cushing's in dog is a tumor of the adrenal cortex. So let's review, right? You've got the hypothalamus, which is releasing corticotropic releasing hormone. That acts on the anterior pituitary, which releases ACTH. That acts on the adrenal cortex to produce the release of cortisol. Now, if this dog has a tumor of the adrenal cortex, it is Cushing's, high levels of cortisol due to a tumor here. Negative feedback. Dog presents, you think diabetes mellitus, you measure cortisol, elevated. You then run the blood for ACTH, CRH. If the tumor is here in the adrenal cortex, the anterior pituitary perceives that ACTH levels are low, CRH levels are low. If the tumor is in the anterior pituitary, so here, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, adrenal cortex. If the tumor is here, Then you have elevated levels of ACTH, increases cortisol, but decreased levels of CRH. By using different hormones sampled from the different tissues, you can pinpoint the source of the tumor. Again, that becomes very important clinically. Adrenal cortical tumors, very easy to treat. Anterior pituitary hypothalamic tumors, very, very difficult. Alterations in aldosterone production. The most common presenting types is decreased levels of aldosterone. Again, named for an English physician called Addison's. So, decreased levels of aldosterone leads to decreased water retention. Depletion of sodium. These individuals are hypotensive, dehydrated. Cats get Addison's disease. Lethargic. Interestingly, in Addison's disease, you also see a decrease in cortisol commonly. That produces a hypoglycemia. So, Cushing's, hyperglycemia. Addison's, hypoglycemia. Lack of energy. So these cats come in, they tend to be relatively thin, in part because they don't have a lot of fluid in them. They're dehydrated. They're very lethargic. One of the ways I saw a diagnostic made in clinics was the radiologist, they didn't know. The cat presented, it was skinny. They took a radiograph. The heart shadow was excessively small. Looked like a small heart. Well, why? Didn't have as much fluid in it. Had nothing to do with the cardiac tissue itself. Had to do with the image. And the size of the heart was smaller because the animal had decreased levels of aldosterone. So in fact, that diagnosis was precipitated by the radiograph. They went ahead and drew a blood sample, ran a hormone assay, and the animal came back low for aldosterone, clearly identifying that it had Addison's. And again, a disease that's pretty easy to treat. Local hormones. We come back. We talked about the autocrine and the paracrines. So if you turn to plate 128, we're going to focus in on one of those important autocrines. And I kind of gave you a hint at the beginning when we talked about it. We mentioned prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are hormones that have a very localized effect. They do, in fact, circulate through the blood and can have a generalized response. The tissue that prostaglandins were found in high concentrations was, in fact, the prostate, a male secondary sex organ. In fact, we now recognize that prostaglandins are made throughout the body and have a number of effects, some that have to do with males, but also that have nothing to do specifically with sex. Prostaglandins induce contraction of uterine smooth muscle. So here we see, and we'll come back and revisit the reproductive system next. But these smooth muscles, the prostaglandin, again, identified from the prostate gland. The prostaglandins were in the seminal fluid, in impregnation. The prostaglandins produce a contraction of the smooth muscle, which is presumably aimed at sperm transport. Well, we also recognize other actions of prostaglandins. Smooth muscle, prostaglandins are important in bronchodilation, vasodilation, things that are involved in inflammation. So we see prostaglandins important in inflammation. Things that you want to decrease prostaglandins, many of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, aspirin, those are prostaglandin inhibiting compounds. So if you have an excessive inflammation, runny nose, swollen joints, aspirin not only have some analgesic effects, but also anti-inflammatory effects by acting on prostaglandins. Hypothalamic temperature regulation. Prostaglandins raise body temperature. They alter the hypothalamus. They say we need to be hotter. Prostaglandins, important in the inflammatory response to bacteria and virus. You get prostaglandin release, they go up, they elevate your body temperature, and you now have a fever. Fever is adaptive. It is meant to make it more challenging for bacteria and viruses to reproduce. I mentioned leukotrienes, prostaglandins and leukotrienes. They're both kind of evolved from the same general group of compounds and are involved in arthritic disorders. Platelet aggregation. The group of compounds called thromboxanes. So leukotrienes, prostaglandin-like compounds that are involved in the inflammatory response, allergies and rheumatism. Thromboxanes involved in blood clotting. You take aspirin. What's one of the side effects of aspirin? What's called thinning the blood has nothing to do with thinning the blood. It has to do with the fact that aspirin inhibits prostaglandins. It inhibits prostaglandins involved in the aggregation of platelets, which are important in blood clotting. If you take a lot of aspirins, you tend to bleed out more. Prostaglandins also are involved in decreasing acid secretion. So what does that mean? If you take aspirins, that's fever, that's stomach right there. If you take aspirin, you inhibit this. That increases acid secretion. That increases the likelihood of ulcers. If you're at the same time inhibiting clotting, you now can have bleeding ulcers. So long-time prostaglandin inhibition has a number of important side effects. And I think we're going to stop there because we're going to pick up on reproduction for the next lecture.